Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today we are in for a major treat because what we're going to discuss today is something we all love to do: censorship. And we're going to talk about censorship in cinema, mainly the Central Board of the Central Board of Film Certification, and we're going to talk about how it has become an arbitrary uh, and often an irrational tool in the hands of the powers that be. We will talk about its scope. We're going to uh, talk about where how it is impacting our social, cultural, and political life, and we will talk about uh, where it stands today in its present situation and uh, where it is heading. So we have the best people to have this discussion with. We have the film critic and the curator, Mr. T.S. Venkiteswaran. We have Professor Lawrence Liang, Professor School of Legal and Political Studies, Ambedkar University. And we have Mr. Saurav Das, independent journalist and columnist. So, welcome to Frontline's webinar on on the censor board and its impact on our society. Now, very recently, we saw certain issues coming to the fore, particularly the case of the film JSK Janaki versus State of Kerala, and of which Mr. Das has written Frontline. And then yesterday we also had this interview with Hanif Rehan, who categorically stated that the CBFC is a backdoor to controlling freedom of expression in this country. Now, I want to start with Mr. Da, and can you explain to us, given the way the CPSC exists today, uh, can you put it in its historical perspective and explain very briefly its scope and powers, and if it has at all strayed from the the vision of the makers of the constitution, from the from the way, way the censor board was envisioned in 1952. Uh, Very briefly, we can sum it up and then move forward.
All right. Thank you for having me here. In my understanding, I think the censor board is doing what it was always supposed to do, which is basically to define the limits of a society. There's a book called Censorium. It was published in 2013, which is a fantastic to understand more about the CBFC and its role and its historical perspective. Must read that book. It actually shows how the CBFC has always been what has been doing what it has been doing since its inception in 1952. And for a very long time, the board was actually called the censor board officially until 1983, if I'm not wrong. That is when the name of the board also changed. So the CBFC has always seen as a producer of societal norms, not just as a regulator of content. It has constantly tried to define the moral, the national norms that a society must follow, right? So even in this case of Janaki, it is actually doing what it has already done, which is to actually redefine the sentiments of the public. Maybe 98% people who would have gone and watched the film with that name intact wouldn't have actually realized that it belonged to a Hindu deity. But what the CBFC has actually done by actually asking the producers to change that name is to bring it into public discussion and re-engineer minds where the sensibilities of the public, especially the middle class, is intact, and it is also redefined in the minds of those people who wouldn't have taken an offense to that name. So it has always done that. We have seen how many kissa kursi ka during emergency and other times when the CBFC has actually banned those films. But what we are seeing now and in today's context is under an authoritarian regime, if I may call it so. It has worked really hard to to construct sentiments, sentiments that people may not even be having it, to stir those sentiments and actually redefine the norms in the minds of the people. So that is the difference that we see post 2014 and pre 2014, in my opinion.
Now, this does, in many ways, it does intrude upon the way a country is, well, society, where people are thinking. That itself it's an impingement on our individual thought process, right? So, how far do you think, like, how far do you think this can work? I mean, we have heard uh, members of the censor board saying things like, "I don't think the country is quite ready for that term yet," and it is, like you said, like the talking to those ludicrous reasons. So, uh, Mr. Venkiteswaran, how far does such an attitude curb the quality of filmmaking, and how far does impact the impact art in its whole encompassing? Because this is not just cinema; it's practically
Yeah, to continue what Saurav was saying, like we've been talking about censorship over the last 1 century, right from the post-colonial times, nationalist movement times. Then you had the post-independence decades when different kinds of discourse came up. Then it gets much more, vigor in the post-emergency period when a lot of political questions were raised. The whole new discourse about censorship. We had this encounter with the dark side of the state, and then the whole discourse around censorship changed. Then the next phase, I think, starts with the 90s, liberalization and globalization, when we had different kinds of arguments coming up about westernization of culture, about all those things, nudity, permissiveness. All these questions were asked again, like from a fresh perspective, threat from the West, and the whole idea of Bharatiya Sanskriti and all this began there. Then I think the last 2 decades that the scene has entirely changed. I think we've entered a new era of censorship, which encompasses all forms of expression and is all pervasive. Because if you look at the picture now, you have multi-tier system of censorship at work. You have this censor CBFC, which approves or disapproves or suggests changes and all that. Then even if it is actually during the last few years, it has been manned by Hindutva ideologues and the of the government, that even if the film passes through the certification process, it can at any moment be attacked by social media or self-proclaimed representatives of certain groups or communities. Then this whole hurt sentiment drama is unfolded, and which again acts as a kind of mob censorship, an extra state censorship that can erupt at any point of time on any issue. Like it could be the content, it could be a title, it could be a scene, it could be a dialogue, it could be setting, it could be some sort of symbolism, because you have seen all those happening during the last decade. Then finally, all these have, I think, the saddest part is that all these have actually led to a massive forms of self-censorship, right from scripting to post-production. Like at every stage, it is being institutionalized, censorship, to see whether there is any part of the movie, anything in the movie that could hurt sentiments or that could go against the powers that be. So there is a huge amount of self-censorship at work at the moment. Apart from all these, like you even have other kinds of censorship. Like for instance, if you take the case of Malayalam film like Empuran, you have a kind of censorship where the producers themselves withdrew the film, re-edited it, removing the so-called offensive portions, and then re-releasing it. So you have this multi-tier systems of censorship at work, which actually is overwhelming, atmosphere of fear and threat that define our times, and which makes filmmakers are either forced to keep in line or keep silent. That is, I think, the saddest or the most dangerous part of it. Like in a democratic, so-called democratic country like ours.
So this does impact the quality of a film because the filmmaker cannot give true expression to his craft or to his vision. And what's particularly troubling is that there is no protection. There is no way that the filmmaker can actually go and be seek protection from, because the Film Certificate Appellate Tribunal was done away with. I think in 2021 was it, or I could be mistaken. Very in the last 4 or 5 years, and so the only thing for filmmakers to do is to take, to move the court. So, Professor Liang, uh, could you talk about some aspects of the legal ramifications of this kind of censorship? Because as Mr. Venkiteswaran said, that the situation is actually is heading from bad, and Saurav also said that the situation is heading from bad to worse. And so, could you talk about the legal ramifications? We talked about the artistic bit, so now let's talk about.
Sure. So the first thing to remember about film censorship is that it's slightly different from any other form of censorship, because in the case of a book, you need no one's permission to write the book. Now, consequent to publishing a book, you may face action in the form of a defamation claim or, arguments that it's seditious, etc. So censorship in the case of cinema has always been slightly different in that it entails a certain idea of a pre-censorship, which is that according to the Cinematograph Act, no one is allowed to publicly exhibit a film unless they've already acquired a censor certificate. Now, this is again, something that's always been there. There's nothing new about it. But what is interesting is that we're talking about a transformed kind of, ecosystem in which censorship is actually taking place. So as Venkatesh rightly mentioned, if on the one hand, you were accustomed to a certain kind of a vertical understanding of censorship, which is primarily between state and citizens or state and creators, there is another dimension right now, which is really about a certain kind of a horizontal level with which censorship actually operates, and that is really in a way about the kind of use of what is popularly known as the heckler's veto, which is when crowds or when mobs kind of object to certain kinds of content. And this objection is already anticipated in a way by state actors such as the CBFC. Now, there is a long history of court rulings that have been relatively good on the question of what are the extent of protections that a writer or a speaker or a filmmaker has. Now, in the Indian context, film has not done as well as, let's say, the other mediums such as literature, etc. But nonetheless, you do have a number of judgments which have actually talked about how if Article 19(1)(a), which is the freedom of speech and expression, is a fundamental right, interestingly, when you obtain a film censor certificate, you're not just subjecting yourself to censorship, you're also obtaining protection. A good instance of this is Raj Kapoor's film, Satyam Shivam Sundaram, which was released after having obtained a censor certificate, and subsequently an obscenity charge was made against the film. The filmmaker went to court to say that, look, if I have obtained a film certificate, it means that the state has already certified the film to be, that it can be seen by a particular class of audience. And now I have a proactive right against, criminal complaints being made against me. In a similar manner, the courts have also kind of observed that it is a duty that is cast upon the state when there is a threat, as there was recently, for example, in the case of Mani Ratnam's film, Thug Life, after Kamal Hassan's controversial statements on Kannada and Tamil. Courts have routinely held that there is a kind of a positive obligation cast upon the state to ensure that it protects the filmmaker and the exhibitors against the mob. So I think what we are seeing now is that this vertical and the horizontal dimension coming together is actually a new mode in which we can think about the idea of film censorship, because it's no longer just about state versus citizen. We're looking at the emergence of a certain kind of a meta censorship, which again has existed in the past. So if you take, for example, the Mani Ratnam's film Bombay, Bal Thackeray had insisted that the film be shown to him before it was released on screen. Otherwise, he would not have it allow it to be released. And he objected to one particular kind of film. So that kind of thing has always existed. But in a way, they were always in silos, and they were seen to be kind of, in independent spaces. The question that really arises is what happens when there is an internalizing of the logic of the heckler's veto within state functionary boards like the CBFC.
So we got an interesting comment here by Ashish Sengupta at the comment box. He's saying that doesn't such censorship betray an anxiety inherent in the formation of hyper-nationalist narrative of society? Anxiety about the fragility of the edifice of the far right always builds? Well, what do you say to that? I think I tend to agree.
There's also a statement immediately after that which says that censorship has never been only about the right. It's always been left, right, and center. And I think that there is an element of truth to that.
Absolutely. I mean, we picked out. I recall way back sometime in the 90s, late 90s, the CPIM in West Bengal actually went and stopped a show during the Calcutta Film Festival because it was projecting Lenin in poor light, and the cadres went and stopped the show. So we've seen that happening with left also. So it's not necessarily restricted to left, right, or center. It has more to do with whoever is in power and whatever makes that party in power uncomfortable.
There's also, Saurav mentioned something about the very peculiar nature of film. I think there is an argument to be made about the nature of film as a medium in the context of a democracy like India. When Saurav talked about William Mazzarella's work, this is the argument he makes. He says there's something peculiar about film because it brings together two things. It brings together, on the one hand, the idea of mechanical reproduction, while at the same time capturing the idea of liveness in the sense of a performance. There's something peculiar. So if you take, for example, one of the first cases that challenged the constitutional validity of the Cinematograph Act, which is the K.A. Abbas judgment, where the courts upheld the validity of the Cinematograph Act, one of the arguments that they made was that cinema has to be distinguished as a medium from any other medium. And this is really a question that we all need to ask today, because there is almost, in a way, a 19th century or a late 19th century assumption about the impact of cinema on a certain kind of a naive audience. And there is a colonial assumption here. Because when cinema came into India, one of the arguments of the British was that the native subject could not distinguish between reality and illusion, and hence they needed a kind of a regulatory mechanism that would teach them how to see. So it's kind of ironic that today, when we are talking about Janaki versus State of Kerala and the use of the name, one of the very first censorship cases in the country was in 1921, when Kohinoor's Bhakta Vidur was banned in Madras and then finally in Sindh. Interestingly, why was it banned? Because the British said that, we know what you're doing. This is not Vidur. This is Gandhiji. We won't allow it. So there's always been this idea of what images and names stand in for. So in that sense, it's an old debate. It's just that the form changes. And there is a certain kind of an acceleration of the logic when it comes to its current avatar, but it's always been around.
Yeah, to add to what Lawrence was saying, there is also this kind of, very contradictory kind of ways in which you look at this public, which is seen on the one hand as very passive and infantile, immature, prone to, and also very hyperactive, prone to violence and writing and all that. There is a very, very interesting way in which censorship rules and discourses work their way around these very contradictory kind of images of the public. There's also one more important thing that I think this mozzarella book, Sensorium, brings out is that what is specific about cinema is that cinema, like other kinds of mass medium, does not simply represent communities. It helps make them. The critical question, therefore, she says is that it's not just the accuracy or fairness of images, but more fundamentally the ways they make community publicly imaginable or communicable in the first place, which I think is very important because cinema is a medium that helps to produce public structures of subjectivity, which is very important. Because when you say this is offensive, like Saurav was saying, like the name Janaki may not offend anyone, but the moment you utter it, it becomes a problem. And it becomes a kind of point around which different kinds of forces can rally around. This is what is happening now.
I agree with what my fellow panelists just said. You see this even in the case of Santosh. So the number of cuts that were recommended by the CBFC, it's a very thought-provoking film. But I think the CBFC and therefore the largest state really thinks that people are perhaps too naive to grasp the reality, or they would much prefer the masses didn't wake up to that reality. We see the same thing with Punjab 95 also. The fantastic interview that Frontline did with the director of the film. So you see, even it is also representative in the board's membership today, right? So Vivek Agnihotri is part of the censor board. Now, in a very famous interview, he did say that facts are not facts and that emotional truth mattered more, right? And now him coming into the censor board, and we see the censor board acting in such a manner also, where, arbitrary application of law, the guidelines in itself are very vague and, are so broad that it's almost a blank check for the censor board to, regulate or ask for a number of cuts or even stop the film from being publicly screened. So Vivek Agnihotri actually coming into that board also really is it shows the current status of the CBFC also.
I want to jump in here to, just say that perhaps one of the ways of actually thinking about the difference between a generic idea of political censorship that always existed to a new form that we're looking at is really one way of thinking about it is looking at the route that you travel between a form of sarkari censorship and a form of sanskari censorship. And what happens when the two actually converge in the way that the sarkari censorship becomes subsumed entirely to the idea of samskari censorship. And I think that's what's kind of, new about the current moment that we seem to be, living in.
Also, if you look at the major points of debate, they usually, censorship revolved around 2 or 3 questions like sex, violence, and politics. Okay, politics always has been a contentious issue right from the colonial times. Now, if you look at the pattern of censorship and the kind of the scenes or things that they permit during the last few years, you can see that violence is permitted. Like any kind of, if you look at films like Animal or Marco, graphic, visceral violence that is portrayed on screen is very easily permitted. Whereas violence against women, violence against minorities, all these are permitted. While even a hint of some sort of so-called political or any sentiment that any reference that hurts certain groups is especially Hindutva groups is very, very strictly monitored and controlled. We have this changing combination of how sex, violence, and politics is taken into consideration by the censor board is also interesting because violence is permitted, any amount of violence.
You're right, in the sense that violence is permitted, any amount of suggestive purpose as far as sex is permitted, but there is also a kind of a very latent attempt in controlling the culture, the cultural aspect of a cinema, controlling the artistic expression of a cinema, using various reasons that can range from the ludicrous to the completely irrational to the overtly political. Now, in this situation, there's a question by Probal K, who says, "Sir, to what extent can censorship be justified in a democratic society like India, which has such a huge diversity where conflict of morals is inevitable between different sections of society?" So we can accept that there is bound to be there's bound to be some people will take offense and something like that. So where does the censor board draw its line? Should it, just try and please everybody and just ban everything, like it seems to be doing right now? Not ban everything, but we've seen like ridiculous, cinema taking ridiculous liberties with history, and there's no problem of them getting the certificate and being shown, while thoroughly researched historical facts are being suppressed by the board, saying that it's too sensitive a topic to be displayed. So where does the censor board draw its line? How can it please everybody? Can it, or is it just going to keep?
Censorship seems to be one of those, kind of fault lines. And I think it's a difficult one because, very often the battle between the left and the right is drawn on the line of what is good and what is bad censorship, right? So ironically, for example, if you take even K. Abbas, in the Abbas judgment, what worked against Abbas eventually was Justice Hidayatullah pointing out that Abbas had appeared before something called the Khosla Committee a few years before this judgment, in which Abbas had basically talked about the crude commercialization of cinema and the need for censorship. So Abbas was coming in from a position of the left, arguing about the need for good kinds of forms of censorship. And then, of course, there is the decrying of the bad kinds of censorship. And I think that it raises a difficult question, which is, do you take a principled position in general on the question of freedom of speech and expression and liberty, and defend that and say that part of what it entails would also entail listening to a lot of things that are absolutely disagreeable? Or do you actually also take a slightly more nuanced position to say that this abstract commitment to free speech is fine, but if you look at the relationship between kinds of forms of propaganda, forms of hate speech that actually do have a direct bearing on violence, as well as on the propagation of kind of stereotypes against communities, should one actually have an abstract commitment or should it be a contextual? Now, this is again a debate I don't think that can be resolved in any easy manner. So for the CBFC to presume that it is an actor that is able in a way to kind of pander to, every kind of claim that is made would basically result in a world without cinema, because I don't think you can actually point out any text, cultural, literary, artistic, that will not in some ways offend someone or the other. Otherwise, really, it would be, an advertisement for a chocolate. It would not really be an artistic work. So,
Yeah, to add to what Lawrence was saying, like recently, yesterday or day before, one of the advocates, activist advocates, Harish Vasudevan, has actually filed an RPI seeking the list of names of gods and goddesses that can be used. Okay, you give me a list of gods and goddesses so that I can, because I'm going to make a film, I want to name my characters. So I want to know which to avoid and which I can use. So give me a list of all the gods and goddesses. It's a funny way in which you can take this on.
but there's also, again, a long history to this. In 1935, Shantaram had made Dharmatma, which was about the Marathi poet Eknath. Now, that wasn't the original title of the film, because the original title of the film was Mahatma. And again, if you think about, the controversy about Deepa Mehta's Fire, one of the objections that Bal Thackeray had to the film was the use of the names of, two goddesses for the two characters in the film. And his insistence was that, change the names into the names of another community and I'll be fine. So,
Yeah, if I can just add to that, every society always is in a process to define its expressive boundaries, and that is bound to happen. But I agree with Professor Liang also that every movie which is worth its salt will have something or the other which might offend existing narratives, existing stories, and the present system, right? Otherwise, it's going to be a very safe story, bereft of any kind of critical thinking that makes people think and call it a piece of, a masterpiece. But I think when it comes to censoring, again, it's a very difficult question. An element of discretion will always lie with the censoring body, with the CBFC in India. So I think we need to make peace with that element of discretion, and I think ultimately it would really depend on who helms bodies like these. When these cases are challenged in the High Court, it goes before judges who are judicially trained, have know different perspectives, and see these perspectives unfold in their daily life, like when they're hearing cases. So they have different perspectives, and then they apply their mind, and then we get these landmark judgments, a pass, and other cases. The Udta Punjab case, where the High Court actually said that you can't dictate to the filmmakers what kind of stories and the manner in which they narrate their stories, right? But despite that, we see the CBFC acting in a similar fashion. And there were 95 cuts recommended for Udta Punjab, but for Punjab 95, there are more than 125 cuts. So it has worsened almost. So I think it really depends on who is at the helm of these bodies and what application of mind, what are they applying when they are, certifying these films. It really comes down to that.
I think we could also take into consideration, I think, talking about the changing patterns of censorship and how it works, the body of CBFC works. It is also something that is happening to media in general. For instance, I think we have to look at it from the changing dynamics between this triad, like the state, capital, and civil society. What is happening to this dynamics between these three, state, capital, and civil society? Because if you had some sort of forums or ways in which you can challenge judicially certain kinds of decisions of the state, that is no longer going to happen. That is, those doors are closing down, because your judiciary, your bureaucracy, everything is filled with people who are in tune with the powers that be. Then you also have this this dangerous instances where state is colluding with capital. All these television channels and OTT platforms are actually colluding with the state interest to bring. They have taken out a lot of interesting films. They have they're very careful about the series that are happening. For instance, if you look at the history of Indian series, like you had series like Sacred Games or Padal Lok, Laila, all those like that. Those kinds of series are again not going to happen. So there is a kind of censorship happening within the so-called transnational corporates, colluding with the state to work against civil society in that sense. So this is also a question which brings into focus this relationship dynamics between capital, state, and society.
No, I think Venkatesh is absolutely right, because there's a particular logic in terms of the political economy of filmmaking, which is very different from, let's say, a novelist or a playwright. It's primarily an industrial form of art in the case of commercial cinema. And so what you have really is, even in the case of, Janaki versus State of Kerala, the filmmakers have basically conceded and accepted some of the changes that have been asked, primarily because of the problem of the release date. And I think this question of the distribution and the exhibition logic is so kind of, in a way tyrannical. In a time when cinema is in any case struggling to find viewers in, the cinema hall. And in the history of censorship of cinema, this has always been a case. In one of the earliest cases, which is the first case in the US about film censorship, the company was a company that actually made children's cinema. So their films were not actually being censored. The problem was that censorship was imposing a transaction cost in terms of time and money. And so there was a problem which is a larger one than just content. I mean, there's a way in which the logic of governmentality that governs film censorship then kind of, really, really limits what you can do, even if you want to challenge things. So what Venkatesh and Saurav has said, that there's an internalizing of the logic of the censor board. You already anticipate what the censor board, will object to when you're making a film in terms of what you're submitting to them. And that chilling effect is one, when internalized, will move away from just being a chilling effect to being a chilling cascade. And we can see this with the OTTs. We know, for example, Prime and Netflix, etc., from various accounts are not willing to take on any controversial subjects because there is a chilling cascade that they've already felt because of the individual cases.
Absolutely. I'll just add to that. When topics like these come up for discussions, some of my friends who are filmmakers keep telling me that, the OTT platforms have completely capitulated to government's pressures, and the larger threat of OTT regulation, which would really be, disastrous for their business probably. So they have entirely capitulated, and writers take years together to actually create something, some piece of art, right? Something worth its salt. But once they approach these OTT platforms, they usually, I mean, if it's critical, if it might even hurt a little bit of the sentiments of the powers that be, they usually refuse. But the second question they do ask is the content second screen enough, right? Second screen content is something that would not require a viewer's active attention, something that you would watch over, having lunch or something. So even that, the quality of the content that is being asked by these OTT platforms have really betrayed the sentiment that, once people had, that these platforms would be independent and would actually give that space to critical filmmakers to actually create something meaningful. So that is really happening within the industry. And mind you that the Supreme Court, an incoming Chief Justice of India, is also pressing the government for OTT regulations. Now, should there be regulation or should there not be regulation is a different debate altogether. But the court itself, the government has attempted to bring in some sort of regulations for these OTT platforms, but they haven't worked so much. But if there is judicial pressure on the government, then things change.
I was reminded of this book by Ashish Rajathacha for the John Khatak Tarkovsky, Citizens, Filmmakers, and Hackers. Talks about the film cinema as a means of protest, and it's also kind of very it very beautifully puts forward how the state is in dread of cinema. And what we're seeing is that this dread of cinema that the state has is now also going the other way, in the sense that the industry is now also in dread of the state, and hence it is making these modifications, it is making these changes often unasked for, just to avoid problems, just to avoid delays in release. So in this situation, where does we're talking about a bigger picture of cinema. What is it about cinema that makes the state so afraid of? And what is it about the state that makes the filmmakers today, apart from the powers that the filmmakers today, be so afraid of the state?
I think this has to be historically contextualized. We have inherited, in a way, a kind of an absolute colonial anxiety about cinema. And the reason for that anxiety has to do with the peculiar kind of powers of cinema. And we have a paradox here. Because on the one hand, if you're a filmmaker, you have to believe in the magic of cinema and its ability to move people in a way that really kind of engulfs their passions, while at the same time saying that, look, cinema should be treated as any other medium. So there's a paradox. There's a paradox of what is in film theory called the medium specificity argument. Because the colonial anxiety of cinema really came from this idea that here was a technology that was galvanizing people in a manner that had hitherto not happened before, which is in anonymity and in darkness, but brought together by a certain kind of a heightened affect and a heightened kind of a passion. And their fear was the transformation of this kind of collective passion into a political passion. Which would then become, part of the colonial movement and nationalist movement. So a lot of the early films were motivated by a nationalist sentiment. So, Dada Saheb Phalke made Raja Harishchandra after watching the life of Christ and saying, where are the figures of the Indian gods? Where are, our own cultures, etc.? And a lot of the use of Hindu mythology was precisely because of the fact that you needed to make political films, but in a metaphorical manner. Since you couldn't show the British directly, you would show them as, as Kichaka or as Kamsa. There was a way in which Hindu mythology was a great allegorical kind of a tool to talk about the domain of anti-colonial politics. So I think that realm that we have inherited in the post-colonial has moved from the domain of the idea of the native subject into the domain of the social. But what underlines, the commonality between the two is really the presumption of the ignorant or the passive viewer. And I think that really has to change. I mean, one of the, participants has asked the question of, where do we go from here? What are the models that we can think of? And that, I think, is a starting point. How can we imagine a form of cinema regulation that's kind of post-media literate, where it doesn't presume the idea of the naive viewer who's susceptible to cinema, but one that's already has a certain amount of agency because they're born literate in terms of media.
Professor Liang, there's a question for you here by Joseph Jill. Are there any global examples or models India can emulate? Is Scandinavia a good example?
So the name of our CBFC, which is the Board of Film Certification, is itself actually in a way the answer, which is that a lot of countries go by the logic that certification of films is different from the censorship of films, which is to say that you certify according to the basis of age. It can come with other kinds of, key words and warnings about what the content is so that people can choose. And I think that is really in some ways the model to go, which is that let's take the film certification board at its name and say, this is what you ought to be doing. Again, just to make a historical parallel, because we're almost now exactly 100 years from when this happened. In the 1920s, when the largest film committee, the Indian Cinematograph Committee, was constituted, one of the people that it interviewed was Lala Lajpat Rai. And the argument was that, films in India needed to be censored because the native audience wasn't ready. Precisely because, they were illiterate, they were, politically immature, etc. Lala Lajpat Rai, I think, gave an answer that was bang on then and is bang on today. He said that I don't want the future citizens of India growing up in a nursery. They should be exposed to everything, good and bad, because the only way in which they will become full-fledged citizens is once they take their own decision, having been exposed to everything that's good and bad. And I think that's as true today as it was then. So it's kind of sad that in 2025, 100 years from the time that we had the Indian Cinematograph Committee, that we're reverting back to a certain kind of an infantilized imagination of what the Indian polity might be.
Coming back to an earlier topic we just discussed about the dread of cinema. Recently, Sid M has pointed out that recently the CBFC discontinued publishing cut lists on its website. Until now, controversial cuts used to be picked up by news channels and carried to wider masses. But this move by the CBFC again puts the onus on filmmakers to explain their films beyond the screen and take to the public court about dilution. What does the currently dismantled transparency actually mean to filmmakers and audience? Venkiteswaran?
Yeah, true. I think this the question of transparency or any sort of any space for discussion or rational kind of debate is past actually, because you have removed this, as we mentioned earlier, we have removed this appellate tribunal. Now filmmakers have to go to the high court, and the cases are, if at all you have the money to approach the high court, it is judged by general people who are not aware of cinema, or they're not film people. So all these blocks have been made. And also, if you look at the kind of the ways in which censorship rules and discourses have evolved through time, I think earlier you have, as actually Mazzarella points this out, like you are moving from some, earlier you had this very anatomical specific prohibitions. Now it is moving to more aesthetic and general principles, like so it can encompass anything. So that is the kind of situation that we are in, and so filmmakers have either to fall in line or keep away, like become a very dangerous kind of game. Although especially so for the case of independent filmmakers, and also we should also think about the ways in which it's not just about established platforms, like cinema halls or television, OTT, and all that. This is also percolated to film festivals. For instance, for a film festival to happen in any part of India, they have to get this list of films cleared by INB. So there is a kind of another kind of censorship, where earlier film festivals can have any kind of films from any part of the world. They can show it because it's a kind of film festival audience. Now they have to get clear. So all these are actually putting blocks on any kind of independent.
I really do think, I could only, see Arundeep from the Hindu actually tracking all the film cut lists, and regularly putting out on Twitter, which has now stopped because they've changed the method to track these film cut lists. I think there's a larger discussion about, the CBFC and its powers, outside from academic circles and filmmaker circles. Only when, you see these cases coming up in high courts and there's a huge, uproar about it, that is when people start discussing. So even what Professor Liang said, after 100 years, we are still discussing about, what was said. We seem to have regressed so much more. The new certification rules 2024, they have actually concentrated more powers in the hands of the chairman, the chairperson, and also has brought in a larger influence of the central government by way of advisory panels, which is taking decisions in all these films which are controversial or have become controversial. So it's part of the larger regression of our rights that we see in other mediums, other spaces also.
I think we should also talk about the strategies of survival. How do you actually, if you can't work your way through, get your way through the censorship, can you get your way around it? So maybe I think we are thrown back to colonial times. When you have to actually confront a particular kind of a dispensation, where you have to find new symbolisms, new ways in which you work around these rules to make your point. Maybe through humor, maybe through metaphors, allegories. I don't know. Like, I think we should also think about strategies of how you go around these kinds of, because it has always been there, and filmmakers have been creative enough to find their ways around it. So I think you have to look for new ways of not only imagining films, making films, narrating your stories, and also you have to find new networks of streaming platforms or crowd-funded channels or something like that.
It was so good to see that. It was so good to see that Santosh not allowed for theatrical release in India is UK's official Oscars entry in a certain category. So I think that is one of the strategies perhaps that is working out right now.
No, I think Venkatesh, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the interesting things about film censorship in India is that it's also engendered and created very peculiar kind of cultural forms. So if you take, for example, Madhav Prasad says that one of the iconic kind of, scenes that you always see in 1970s and 1980s cinema is because the kiss was not allowed. when you have a boy and girl about to lip lock, then they're replaced by two birds or two flowers hitting each other. And he has a wonderful argument. He says that, what the filmmaker is telling you here is not that it's not a denial of the kiss. What he's telling you is that what I'm showing you is censorship. Because I cannot show you the kiss, I'm showing you, two birds and two flowers. And that's a form that's unique in a way to the Indian kind of filmic expression. So I think we have to take from, what the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges says. He says that censorship is the mother of metaphor. Where you say that, look, let's stop fighting it and let's start subverting it. There's a difference between the two. And again, in Indian, cultural history, there's a lot of interesting examples of this. When Satyadev Dubey was putting up a version of Vijay Tendulkar's Gid, there's a scene in the play where, the father-in-law kicks his daughter-in-law and she has a miscarriage and she comes onto stage with her sari completely red, and they use red ink. So the police in that instance said, no, you cannot show the miscarriage and you can't use the red ink. So when the play was performed, Satyadev Dubey came before the play and said that there is going to be a scene of violence where a woman is going to come with her sari drenched in blue ink. You have to imagine that it is red ink. And I think it's these subversive forms that will also produce all kinds of new, kind of cultural possibilities for cinema in India.
But that is that's also a little sad, isn't it? Like when we have to find ways to get around the system, and the system is so obviously politicized. In the sense that I recall the last written Frontline that the earlier Pahlad Nilani was replaced by Prasool Doshi, and it's just like it was a more polished individual, but an equally servile individual. So there is a very obvious attempt to control the art form, which has an enormous impact on society, because that is what we've discussed also earlier about the nature of cinema and its impact on society. So this is a way of controlling that society itself and how society should think. Now, what lies ahead, as you said, but it's not perhaps always possible for a filmmaker to create via metaphors, to have. So what lies ahead if they have to continue with this particular process? Do we need a new body to come up that gives protection to the maybe an extra government body, not necessarily one formed by the government, by means of associations and unions? They've also been active. They've also come to the defense of filmmakers whenever they've been targeted by the social media and by the government. So what lies ahead? What needs to be done so that filmmakers can continue making the kind of films they want to make and not have to hide behind various other kinds of things?
Maybe it's very difficult to do it in the given revenue models of exhibition and distribution and all that. Maybe you have to think of alternate ways of sharing films, making films and all that. And it is especially this kind of censorship is also difficult in digital times. You can work your way around. You can come back. You can access your audience through other means, through different kinds of platforms. And I think new kinds of networking and collectives will emerge to circulate these counter narratives. That should be possible. And also within the film, I think a lot of subterfuges, like how do you cope with and how do you subvert the existing status quoist kind of discourses, and that is also in many films. I think you can see them at work, like though they do confront a lot of censorship hurdles and all that, but still they get made, especially in many languages like Tamil or Malayalam or Marathi, Northeast. A lot of films are going.
We're also talking about not just the censor board, but we're also talking about how difficult it is for filmmakers to pursue their craft, given the kind of political situation in different parts of the country today. For example, one doesn't. There are these unofficial gagging. There are, for example, one thing that comes to mind is a few years ago there was this Bengali cinema called Bhuvishwater Bhoot, and unofficially the screening was stopped because it made fun of the ruling party and the ruling government. So it's not just the censor board. I mean, there is an extra government, extra constitutional censor board that exists, making life even more difficult for filmmakers. So how do we deal with that? And the situation has been worsened by the social media, by like Professor Liang has said, like we have these pressure groups that are operating outside the government. So where do we go from here? Where does a filmmaker go from here? Like, is it continuously going to court, or
into hiding, it appears. No, so I mean, just to take this, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think about the transformation of censorship, and I've argued this before, where I said that it's not enough to talk about censorship. It's important to actually now fine tune it and kind of speak about its granular. So you have really something where you have, let's say, an extra constitutional authority acting as a censor board. That's a kind of a form of a meta censorship. Then you also have, let's say, censorship through social media and through boycotts, call for boycotts. That's again a very important form where the film is released, but you've actually asked for a social boycott of the film. That's a different kind of censorship. That's a form of a para-censorship. And finally, it results in what Venkatesh has very rightly said, which is an auto-censorship. And I think it's important for us to actually now also think both conceptually as well as strategically on the idea of what it means to deal with this new ecosystem where you have all of these working simultaneously together, because the strategy of responding to them are actually very different. In the case of the vertical form of censorship, you still have, let's say, the courts. You still have, in a way, the arena of public opinion. But what does it mean to actually look at the susceptibility of filmmakers and the film industry to the other forms of censorship? And what kind of support systems are now required to create this, kind of mechanism where people feel they're able to articulate themselves without fear, or even if with fear, with at least some ability to have some support, for what they do. And I think it's one of the challenges of our time to think about what that mechanism might be, and what a commitment to a certain kind of a liberal conception of free speech, what it entails beyond just being outraged about yet another act of censorship.
Yeah, I think talking about support system, right? I just wish there was more philanthropic help for filmmakers, for writers, because a major hurdle that they face is because they are pushed to the fringes, because their work is not valued anymore, and they're asked to do menial jobs and write for production houses that churn out content like a factory. I wish there was more philanthropic help. So that kind of a support system for filmmakers, for artists, I think that is, there's a dearth for it, and people are trying to do something about it. I wish there was more discussion around that. Systematically, I think it is also, there's an unfair burden on the courts right now to actually, protect. I mean, it is their duty, but they are also, reeling under so much workload and so many cases. So, but there's definitely a need for some judicial application of mind when it comes to, this kind of censorship. So I think maybe a discussion around whether we again need a film certification appellate tribunal. Is there a need for it? And when it was in place, what was its, a larger study about how efficacious it was? I think maybe, that's the way to also go, and maybe artists will have to, stand up and talk about it and advocate for such a body. So some judicial application of mine might help. Do you think?
And finally, I think it's important to learn from the documentary filmmakers.
Yeah.
Because it's actually documentary filmmakers who have been subject to censorship more than commercial filmmakers, and who have also worked with exactly the conditions that Venkatesh has talked about. Absence of capital, absence of support, absence of exhibition and screening, and yet they have gone, consistently, doggedly showing their films, to different audiences, whether it's 20 or 200. And there's a need to recognize in a way that, that it's documentary filmmakers who actually led the vanguard of, resisting censorship, film censorship in India, and not so much the commercial filmmakers.
Yeah, definitely. Also, not only about the issues they have raised. If you look at the post-emergency, right from Anand Padmanabhan to the present, I think they are the ones who actually raised a lot of very important questions that our democracy is founded upon. And also, they also, took the initiative to find new platforms of healing, new ways to connect with their intended audience. A lot of campaign modes, film society modes, film festival, a lot of, they actually explored a lot of different platforms to reach out and, welcome, invite the audience into their, discourses. This is very, very important, I think.
That's a very interesting thing. Like if you look at films division, when that came out, it was essentially a government propaganda wing, but then later it developed into its own, had its own voice, found its own voice, had its own artists and makers. But can we talk about a little bit about the need for the change of the basic framework of censorship in this country, as Monica Burike has pointed out here. As societal values and cultural perceptions evolve over time, should content censorship frameworks be dynamically re-evaluated to remain more relevant with the sensibilities of contemporary audiences? Now we're also looking at the censor board, whose powers seem to be undefined, in the sense that everything can come under its radar. So do we need to define the powers of the censor board and know where it can draw the line, tell it where it can draw the line? Venkiteswaran, can you say something about it? Can all of you say? Let's really.
I think it is next to impossible, like, to reform the censor board, because earlier the censor board members, the constitution of the censor board had some sort of democracy at work. Like, you had people from different fields. There was a kind of gender balancing, all those things, and there were some independent people there who could talk rationally and whom the filmmaker could talk to. Like, now it has totally changed. Right? The whole thing has changed to to monitor the content and towards a certain way. Like, that is almost impossible. And also they have taken up this appellate tribunal, which is also very, very, very retrogressive kind of step. Because you had this forum where any filmmaker could approach. It is affordable, it is accessible, and it is also a forum of filmmakers and film people. So you could argue a point, as a filmmaker. Now that is not there. So all these are different kinds of hurdles that are, put. I think there is only one way in which I think we could address this, is by reimagining our narratives, and also to create parallel, platforms of, connecting with the audience, and, creating a kind of community of film viewing. That is what I think we should explore.
And interestingly enough, in 2016, such a re-evaluation did happen in Modi's first term. So the Sham Benegal committee was formed. It submitted a report where it said that this appellate tribunal's jurisdiction should be widened and the membership of the board should be reduced, and that the CBFC should be focusing more on certification rather than censorship. But the government did exactly the opposite later, with the amendment of the Cinematograph Act and the rules thereafter. It brought in the advisory panel. It abolished the FCAT. So we saw a regression. So that reevaluation did happen, but the ends weren't achieved.
I think we're running out of time now, so I'm just going to put one final question, and I want your take, each of you, to give your take on this. So, given the situation as it stands today, what message are we sending to the next generation of film goers and filmmakers, and what kind of an idea are they forming with what's happening around us today?
I think if I can go first, we were discussing these issues which were prevalent 100 years back. So the idea that we are really sending is perhaps after 100 years, we'll be discussing the very same issues if we don't really have a sustained movement, a campaign around these issues, and a larger reimagining of the role of the certification body. So yeah, that is the message that at least my generation is getting at this point in time.
Yeah, true. I think you can't have very hard and fast rules to judge films or to certify or censor, and it's very, very difficult. And any kind of government body that whose mandate is to censor films or give certification will fall in line with the powers that be. So it is not going to create much of a offer any kind of freedom or thing to the filmmakers. So I think only way, as Saurav said, is to create two ways. One is for filmmakers to find ways to get around this. That is one way which filmmakers all through have done. Like even you can see the instance of East Europe, everywhere. Like they have all ways to work around it. So that is one way. Second is they use the possibilities of digital technology and find alternative networks of viewing and appreciating and discussing. That's what I think could be explored and thought of.
Yeah, again, I lost connectivity for a minute.
Yeah, no problem. So we were talking about what message we are sending to the next generation of filmmakers and film goers with the present situation as we stand today. What's your take on that?
I think in a way, if one had to think about the idea that a filmmaker is not merely just a creative practitioner, but a creative practitioner who's constantly working under constraints. And you recognize that, it's pointless in a way to think about constantly a lament, which is that I'm working under such conditions of unfreedom that I'm unable to do what I, want to do. And instead say that the conditions of unfreedom are in a way part of the conditions under which you have to create your practice. And then the question then arises, which is, how do you maintain a political integrity or an intellectual or creative integrity while being strategically intelligent about it? And I think that is really in some ways the challenge of being a filmmaker in 21st century India. And I think that's still a good challenge to stand up to.
Well, I think that's all we have time for. And I really had a great time. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.